Okay, picture this. A cold, pitch-black evening in January 2026. Location, Copenhagen, Denmark. The city is wrapped in darkness, but inside Denmark's government buildings, the lights stay on deep into the night. Senior officials, cabinet ministers, top security figures, all locked into the same rhythm, nonstop phone calls, encrypted messages, emergency briefings. This isn't routine diplomacy. This isn't a drill. Something extraordinary is unfolding. The first instinct is familiar. Is this coming from Moscow? Is this another escalation from Beijing? That's where global crises usually begin. But this time the shock cuts deeper, because the crisis shaking Europe right now isn't coming from America's rivals. It's coming from Washington, D.C., the same city that anchors NATO, the same power meant to guarantee European stability. But on this night, Washington isn't the shield, it's the source of the storm. And then comes the moment that sends shockwaves through every European capital. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, makes a declaration so stunning it leaves allies scrambling for answers. America will launch economic warfare against 8 of its closest European allies. The condition is blunt, non-negotiable, and unprecedented. Hand over Greenland or face the consequences. This is not a proposal, not diplomacy, not partnership. There are no talks offered, no joint framework, no compromise. What's being demanded is direct control, ownership. For Europe, the message is chillingly clear. This isn't pressure to cooperate, it's pressure to surrender. And for the first time in decades, America isn't using its power to protect the alliance. It's using that power against the alliance. Then the threat turns into a deadline. Donald Trump lays out an ultimatum that leaves no room for interpretation. Starting February 1, 2026, 10% tariffs. By June 2026, 25% tariffs, not temporary, not symbolic. These tariffs stay in place until one condition is met. In Trump's own words, Denmark must hand Greenland over to the United States. This isn't trade policy, it's coercion. Tariffs aren't being used to protect American workers or defend U.S. industries. They're being weaponized to force an ally to surrender territory. For Europe, the message is unmistakable. If you don't give us what we want, your economy becomes the battlefield. And at that point, this is no longer just about Greenland. It's about something much bigger. It's about whether economic power has replaced diplomacy as America's primary tool of foreign policy. So let's stop for a moment and ask the obvious question. What exactly is Greenland, and why is it powerful enough to shake the global order? Greenland is an autonomous territory under the sovereignty of Denmark. It's been tied to Denmark for centuries. It has its own government, its own parliament, and full control over its internal affairs. This is not an empty ice sheet. Greenland is home to around 57 people, a small population, yes, but one with a clear identity, a political voice, and legal rights under international law. But Greenland's real weight isn't in its population, it's in its location. Sitting deep inside the Arctic, Greenland occupies one of the most strategic positions on the entire planet, right between North America and Europe, along newly emerging Arctic shipping routes, above vast reserves of rare earth minerals, and directly on the front line of Arctic military competition. As climate change melts the ice, Greenland isn't becoming irrelevant, it's becoming central. That's why this crisis was never really about a remote island. Greenland is a geopolitical choke point, and in 2026 it suddenly became the place where power, sovereignty, and global rules collide. And this idea didn't come out of nowhere. The Greenland crisis of 2026 actually begins 7 years earlier. Back in 2019, during his first term, Donald Trump casually floated an idea that stunned diplomats across Europe. The United States could buy Greenland. At first, it sounded like a joke, a headline grabber, another Trump-style provocation. But Denmark didn't laugh. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen responded bluntly, calling the idea absurd. That single word triggered a very real reaction. Trump, visibly irritated, canceled his official state visit to Copenhagen, a rare and dramatic diplomatic snub between close allies. At the time, most people assumed the story was over, just another Trump controversy that would fade with the news cycle. But it didn't fade, it sank in. The idea of Greenland, its location, its resources, its strategic value, stayed with him, quietly. patiently. And when Trump returned to power years later, one thing became clear. 2019 wasn't a joke. It was the opening chapter. January 2025, Donald Trump returns to the White House, and almost immediately an old idea resurfaces. Greenland is back on the agenda, but this time the tone is different, darker, more urgent, more dangerous. Trump stops talking about Greenland as a purchase. He starts framing it as a national security emergency. He warns that Russia is expanding its military footprint across the Arctic, that China is pushing closer to the region through investment and influence, that American strategic interests are at risk. The language shifts. This is no longer curiosity, this is confrontation. And then come the moves. A special envoy for Greenland is appointed, a clear signal that this is no longer a passing thought. Behind closed doors, conversations begin about military options. Security planners are instructed to accelerate Arctic contingency planning. This isn't diplomacy warming up. This is strategy hardening. By the end of 2025, one thing is clear to European capitals. Greenland is no longer just a topic, it's a target. By January 2026, the ambiguity disappears. Donald Trump says it openly, without filters, without diplomacy. We want full control of Greenland, not access, not cooperation, not expanded basing rights. Control, ownership, this is a critical shift. The United States already has military access to Greenland under long-standing agreements. That isn't enough anymore. Then reporters ask the obvious question, the one everyone is thinking. Would you use military force? Trump doesn't deny it. He doesn't soften it. He doesn't reassure allies. His answer is cold. And direct will go as far as we have to. In that single sentence, a red line is crossed because this is no longer about pressure or posturing. This is a sitting U.S. president openly refusing to rule out military action against NATO-linked territory. From that moment on, Europe understands something terrifying. This crisis isn't theoretical anymore, it's real. This is where the situation becomes truly dangerous, because Greenland isn't some legal gray zone. Greenland is part of Denmark. And Denmark isn't just any country. Denmark is a founding member of NATO. At the heart of NATO lies Article 5, the core principle that has defined Western security for more than 75 years. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all. Now stop for a moment and think about what that actually means. If the United States were to use force against Greenland, this wouldn't just be a dispute with Denmark. It would be America triggering NATO's collective defense clause against itself. U.S. power turned inward. Alliance guarantees collapsing in real time. In plain terms, this wouldn't be a war between alliances. It would be a war inside the alliance. And once Article 5 is broken or worse, weaponized NATO doesn't just weaken, it stops meaning anything at all. This is the moment Europe finally stops absorbing the shock and starts pushing back. Denmark responds first, and it does so without ambiguity. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen delivers a message meant as much for Washington as for the world. Greenland is not for sale. No qualifiers, no diplomatic cushioning, no room for reinterpretation. Then comes Greenland itself, and this is where the narrative fully collapses for the White House. Polling shows over 85% of Greenland's population rejects any form of a U.S. takeover. This isn't elites talking. This isn't Copenhagen imposing its will. This is public consent, and it is overwhelmingly against Washington. Greenland's prime minister makes it even clearer. Sovereignty is our red line. Cooperation? Possible. Partnership? Open for discussion. Security coordination? On the table. But ownership, control, or forced transfer? Not negotiable. At this point, the crisis stops being about diplomacy. It becomes a clash between power and legitimacy, and for the first time in this standoff, power isn't winning. The military line is crossed, and then the crisis moves from rhetoric to action. Donald Trump gives a direct order to Joint Special Operations Command. The task is no longer theoretical. JSOC is instructed to draw up operational plans for taking control of Greenland. Let that sink in. This isn't contingency planning against an adversary. This isn't a war game involving Russia or China. This is active military planning against territory tied to a NATO ally. Inside the Pentagon, the reaction is immediate and deeply uneasy. Senior military officers push back hard. They warn about legal consequences, alliance collapse, and uncontrollable escalation. But the order isn't withdrawn. no public reversal, no internal shutdown, which means something critical has already happened. For the first time in modern history, U.S. Special Operations planners are being asked to prepare for a scenario that could pit America against its own alliance system. At that moment, the question stops being whether this is dangerous. The question becomes, how far can the system bend before it breaks? January 18, 2026, this is the moment the crisis explodes into the open. Donald Trump announces sweeping tariffs, not on rivals, not on adversaries, but on 8 European allies. The countries targeted: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Finland. Why these 8? Because they were participating in a routine NATO exercise called Arctic Endurance, a defensive training mission conducted in Greenland on NATO-linked territory. In other words, they were doing exactly what allies are supposed to do. Trump's response? He labels their presence a threat to the safety, security, and survival of our planet. Read that again. NATO allies conducting a NATO exercise inside NATO territory are now being described by the U.S. president as an existential global threat. This is the moment the logic completely inverts. Collective defense is reframed as provocation. Alliance solidarity is treated as hostility. And tariffs become punishment for loyalty. At this point, Europe isn't just confused, it's alarmed. Because the question is no longer about Greenland. It's about whether being America's ally has become a liability. The fallout is immediate. No waiting, no delayed reaction, no second chances. Global markets read the signal clearly. This crisis isn't noise. It's structural. In a single, brutal wave, the S&P 500 drops 2.1%. The Nasdaq falls 2.4%. The Dow Jones plunges 870 points. More than $1.2 trillion in market value evaporates, and the defensive assets tell the real story. Gold surges to record highs. The U.S. dollar weakens sharply. Investors aren't reacting to data, they're reacting to instability at the center of the system. Markets can handle wars. They can handle crises. What they can't handle is uncertainty coming from the country that anchors global finance. And for the first time in years, Wall Street isn't afraid of Beijing, it isn't afraid of Moscow. It's afraid of Washington. Europe doesn't stay silent. It answers loudly. French President Emmanuel Macron delivers a message aimed straight at the White House. Threats will not influence us. No hedging. No soft diplomacy. Sweden's Prime Minister goes even further. We will not be blackmailed. This marks a psychological shift. For decades, European leaders absorbed pressure quietly to preserve the alliance. Now they're drawing lines in public. And behind the scenes, the response escalates. The European Union begins serious discussions about retaliation, possible restrictions on U.S. tech companies, suspension of recently negotiated trade agreements, the use of economic countermeasures designed specifically for coercive pressure. This is no longer damage control, this is preparation. Europe is signaling something profound. If American power is going to be weaponized against allies, then dependency on that power becomes a risk. And once allies start planning for a world after trust, the alliance doesn't collapse overnight. It slowly, quietly starts to unravel. What happens next is almost unprecedented because the backlash doesn't just come from Europe, it comes from inside the United States. A bipartisan group of senior American lawmakers openly breaks ranks with the White House and travels directly to Denmark. Among them, Lisa Murkowski, Chris Coons, Tom Tillis, Jeannie Shaheen, Don Bacon, Mitch McConnell. This is not quiet dissent. This is public defiance. Their language is brutal. They call the plan shameful, beyond stupid, a direct threat to NATO. Some go even further, warning that this approach could destroy the alliance entirely. For decades, U.S. foreign policy disagreements were kept behind closed doors. Now, American lawmakers are flying overseas to apologize for their own president. That fact alone tells you how far this crisis has gone. And then the people step in. In Newark, something extraordinary happens. Nearly 1/3 of the city's population floods the streets. For a place that small, that's massive, the slogans are unmistakable. Greenland is not for sale. Make America go away. This isn't symbolic protest. This is a collective rejection, emotional, political, and deeply personal. In Copenhagen, the anger spreads. Crowds gather outside the U.S. Embassy. The mood isn't theatrical, it's raw. Shock, betrayal, disbelief. Denmark didn't just feel pressured, it felt humiliated by an ally it had fought alongside for decades. Then, without warning, everything flips. January 21, 2026. Location: the World Economic Forum in Davos. Standing before the global elite, Donald Trump makes a surprise announcement. No military action against Greenland. All tariffs are canceled immediately. Just days after threatening economic war and military escalation, the pressure vanishes. Markets breathe again. Diplomats scramble to interpret the reversal. And the pattern looks familiar. Escalate, shock, retreat, declare victory. Shortly after, Trump meets Mark Rutte. The headline emerges. A framework deal has been reached. The details? Vague. The focus, we're told, is on Arctic security, strategic coordination, cooperation against Russian and Chinese influence, but there's no treaty text, no binding commitments, no territorial changes, just a framework, enough to calm markets, enough to claim success, but not enough to answer the real questions. Trump's message is simple. We got everything we wanted, but the facts tell a very different story. According to Denmark and Greenland, no sovereignty was transferred, no ownership changed hands, no control was conceded, and the idea of occupation was never accepted. What actually remains is cooperation, the same cooperation that could have been achieved through normal diplomacy. In other words, this crisis delivered noise, not transformation. This episode leaves real damage behind. NATO emerges shaken, not broken. American credibility takes a visible hit. Europe accelerates plans to reduce strategic dependence. Markets remain alert, not reassured. This was never a territorial dispute. It was a stress test, a test of alliance trust, global stability, and the rules that prevent power from turning into pure coercion. And the most uncomfortable conclusion of all, America didn't lose ground because of enemies abroad. It lost ground because of instability at the center. Greenland was just the trigger. The real story was the system and how close it came to cracking.